Hey guys, welcome back to my channel, and if you're new, welcome. I'm Alexa Allen, and every week I sit down and talk about a true crime, conspiracy, or a mystery. This week's case is one of those situations where things just get out of control. So to set the scene for this week's case, we're in Hungary in the early 1900s, in a little village called Nagyrev, which is about 60 miles southeast of Budapest. Nagyrev is a little farming village. It has muddy streets, a church, a pub, and cottages lining the streets. Now, at this time in Hungarian culture, the future husbands of teenage girls were decided by their families. They were married off to men that were sometimes much older and sometimes men they didn't even get along with or like. Divorce was not allowed, even if you were abused or your husband was an alcoholic. It just wasn't allowed. So in 1911, this woman, Julius Fascus, arrives to town, and she is highly recommended. She's a nurse and a midwife, and the village is so happy to have her because at the time they had no doctor, and they don't really know much about her at all other than the fact that she had a husband that went missing mysteriously. So Fascus, even though she's a nurse, sort of becomes the local doctor. She takes care of the sick and she births all the children in the village. The women really take to Fascus. They really like her and they go to her with their problems. She ends up becoming an abortionist for some of these women. They found themselves with unwanted pregnancies, and at the time there was a lot of poverty in the area, and some of these women were abused by their husbands and they didn't want to have a child with them. So World War I happens and all the men are sent away to fight to war, all the able-bodied men. So the women are left to care for this village by themselves. And meanwhile, Nagyrev becomes a holding camp for Allied prisoners of war. So bring in these young men and they're sent to help the women tend to their farms. And these women begin to interact with these men and they like some of these men and they're having positive responses with their interactions rather than just treated like trash like a lot of their husbands treated them. They begin to have affairs with these men. They're having a great time. Their husbands are gone. It's a free-for-all, really. And some of these women end up with unwanted pregnancies with these men, and Fascus is back again giving abortions. And between 1911 and 1921, she was actually arrested 10 times for providing illegal abortions. But the judges were really lenient on her every time and let her go because they understood the situation that she was the only doctor in the village, and they took pity on her in the village and let her go. So eventually the war ends and the husbands come back and it's bad news. These men are scarred physically and mentally, and they're estranged from their wives. The wives are now essentially liberated. They've experienced what it's like to actually have a man respect them and appreciate them and to experience what real romance is, and they don't want their husbands back. They resented their husbands for coming back. They saw what it was really like to be free, and they didn't want things to go back to the way they were. So these women are really down about their situations, and Fascus, again, is like, listen, I have an idea. Fascus figures out that if you boil flypaper, you know, the little string strip that you hang from the ceiling, if you boil that in water, the little gooey stuff comes off from it, and that stuff is poison, and it's arsenic. So she's like, let's boil this into water and make a potion, and let's kill our husbands. Let's kill these men. Fascus had a plan to kill these men, and her friend Susie would sign the death certificates, stating that they all were accidental or natural causes. She'd sign them saying disease, heart attack, drowning, and nobody would ask any questions. So we're going to get into some of the names of these women. I'm probably going to butcher them, so don't come for me. So the first woman to poison her husband was a woman named Mrs. Takacs. She took the arsenic and put it in her husband's supper, and it worked. And they listed it as a heart attack, and no one asked any questions. So word started getting around about how easy this was, and the women were like, I want in on this. So more and more women started going to Fascus for this magic problem-solving solution. So with so many women getting involved, they decided, we need to set some rules here. And the rules were that no men could poison their wives. It could only be women poisoning their husbands. And no children were to be poisoned. And they couldn't tell anyone about these services unless they were in need of them. So you couldn't go around gossiping about killing your husband. The death toll in the village was rising and rising as more and more women got a hold of this poison. So with so much of these deaths happening, the men actually started to become really afraid, and they were even afraid to get married. Surrounding villages heard about these deaths, and they stayed away from the village. They thought there was witchcraft or some kind of curse that was going on over there. But these women started to break their own rules. They started poisoning people that weren't only their husbands. They started killing other family members. They would use it on elderly parents so they didn't have to take care of them anymore or to get their inheritance. Children so they didn't have to take care of them or pay the bills that came with having children. Even scorned women would take out their lovers. One woman, Juliana, actually killed this guy's wife so that she could marry him, then killed all of his children so that they wouldn't receive his inheritance, and then she killed her husband. Another woman, Palenka, over the course of 2 years, killed her parents, her husband, her 2 brothers, her sister-in-law, and an aunt, all to receive a house and a few acres of land. Maria Cardos killed her husband, her 23-year-old son, and her lover. Maria Varga poisoned her husband, who came back from the war blind when he found out about her lover. 5 years later, wow, there comes the accent. 5 years later, Maria ended up killing her lover as well. Lydia Siri ended up poisoning her elderly parents. Her neighbors would later testify that they heard her dad yell out, "May the devil take Lydia. She had brewed us tea which has killed us." A woman named Valiant Sortis killed several of her children because she said she had too many mouths to feed. This goes on for over a decade, and people in the surrounding villages are like, okay, we gotta say something. They reported this to the authorities, and the authorities looked into it, but the death certificates were all marked accidental or natural, so everything checked out. But the 1929 census is what really puts a red flag over the village. The death rate was unusually high for such a small village, so investigators decided to go and check it out. They started to question people, and when they questioned this woman named Mrs. Sasbo, she cracked. She outed Fascus and Susie as the ringleaders of the whole operation. So the police brought Fascus and Susie in, and they denied the whole thing. They said, "This woman's crazy, I don't know what you're talking about." So the police go back to Mrs. Zasbo, and they confront her, and they say, they're telling us a different story. They say none of this is true. And she's like, you're right. None of it's true. I made it all up. I was forced into a confession. So the police are like, okay, get out of here. They send them away. They send the ladies back to the village, but they're like, something is up. Something is rotten here. So they decide to surveil the village. And when they get back to the village, the police notice Fascus going door to door to all these women's houses. And they're like, okay, she's telling them something. And of course, she's going to all their houses and she's like, they're on to us. We've got to stop this right now. So one of these women, Valiant, the one who killed her kids, she's super paranoid about this. And she decides to go to the city and go to a chemist. And she's like, hey, just out of curiosity, hypothetically, if someone were to dig up a body that was poisoned by arsenic, would they be able to tell? Would it be detectable? And the chemist is like, yeah, it still would be on their hair and fingernails, absolutely. So Valiant's freaking out, and she goes back to the women and she's like, listen, we're not out of the woods. We've got to do something. They could still figure us out. So that night, 13 of the women, they devised this plan, and they're going to go to the cemetery, rearrange the headstones. So if they were to dig up the bodies, someone that died of a natural cause would be under the headstone of someone that was actually poisoned. But the police, they were still watching, and they confronted them, and they're like, what are you doing? You need to stop right now. You're obviously up to something. We're going to dig up these bodies ASAP, and we're getting to the bottom of this. So they did. They dug up 50 bodies, and all but 4 of them contained arsenic. They were bodies of men, women, children, and even a baby. Also, in all of these coffins, the women put the bottle of arsenic in with the body. to dispose of the evidence, of course. The police raid the village and they arrest almost 100 women. Fascist sees the police coming, and before they can get to her, she drinks her own poison. She's dead by the time they arrive. Valiant was one of the women that were taken into custody, and she admitted to helping poison 20 men and killing her children. Valiant committed suicide that night in prison. 26 of these women were put on trial. 8 of them were given the death penalty, including Susie and her sister Lydia. 7 women received life in prison, and the rest of them got various prison sentences. So this is a crazy story, and I also see it as kind of a cautionary tale. Obviously, there's no excuse for what these women did, but in a lot of these old cases, you see a lot of these women that killed their husbands because they had no other way out. It's too bad, and like I said, there's no excuse for what they did. This is just one of those crazy stories that you can't believe happened. Let me know what you guys think in the comments below. Again, thanks for stopping by, and I'll see you next time.